Foreign ministers, members of the Security Council, good morning. I am grateful to Germany and the Dominican Republic for holding this debate within the framework of Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. I'm honored to speak alongside Special Representative Patton and our brave colleagues from Myanmar and the Central African Republic. Entrenched discrimination in society and the gendered impact of sexual violence demands the actions are taken for survivors. I would like to speak today about one of the most overlooked groups of survivors, the children. When Resolution 2467 was adopted last year, it was the first to put survivors and their needs and their rights at the center of all actions. But resolutions, as we know, are words on paper, and just that, they're promises. And what counts is if those promises are kept. As every member of this council knows, every parent knows, there's nothing worse than breaking a promise to a child. Yet that is what we are doing, year after year, to countless children. The fact that we will never meet them does not lessen the betrayal. I have met child survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence and trauma and abuse everywhere. There is no continent untouched by these crimes. There is no country, rich or poor, that should not take a hard look at its own laws, its own agencies, its own media reporting of these issues, its own treatment of survivors, and its own social attitudes. But I want to start, if I may, with one example. When the so-called Islamic State attacked the Yazidi community in Iraq in 2014, they abducted, enslaved, and tortured thousands of women and children. Many children were murdered, but nearly 2,000 have returned. Many suffered post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression. They experienced flashbacks and recurrent nightmares that are typical of children who have experienced trauma and abuse. Many of the children witnessed the murder of their relatives and the rape of their mothers. One doctor who has provided medical care for Yazidi women and girls said that almost every girl she had treated between the ages of 9 and 17 had been raped or subjected to other sexual violence. In some cases, the victims were girls under the age of 9. They suffer serious health issues, including traumatic fistulas and scarring, in addition to trauma, difficulty accessing education, and even a struggle to prove their identity. Yet, according to a forthcoming report by Amnesty International based on interviews with survivors, humanitarian workers, and other experts, there are still very few services available for Yazidi child survivors and children born of rape. And what services there are have been largely focused on women survivors who have immense trauma and unmet needs of their own, made worse by displacement, poverty, and lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The reality is that no one is getting the care they need. But there is specific lack of dedication for the children. One mother whose daughter was abducted when she was 6 years old and survived 3 years of beating and abuse could not get medical help for her because she was considered too young to treat. Every humanitarian worker interviewed for the Amnesty International report said that the psychosocial services and programs currently available to Yazidi children fall far short of meeting their long-term specialist needs. I have heard this replicated in every conflict setting I have visited for nearly 20 years with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. To be clear, the lack of services flows from the failure of the international community to provide the funds to make this possible, as well as the political will. Sexual and gender-based violence is the most chronically underfunded sector of the humanitarian appeals of the UN, receives less than 1% of humanitarian assistance. So think of how many lives could be saved if we simply doubled that percentage. So I pay tribute to all the humanitarian workers, medics, lawyers, and human rights defenders doing everything in their power to help survivors around the world, often with next to no support. But my concern and my question to the Council is this. If we are not able to live up to our promise of a survivor-centered approach for the Yazidi children, who make up just one relatively small group of survivors, then how many more children and young adults are suffering in silence at a global level? How many more will suffer because of the violence exacerbated by COVID-19 and a distracted international community? The answer is we don't know. The UN Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict said that sexual violence, crimes against children, which are only one of the ways that children's rights are being violated globally, are vastly underreported. The Secretary General's report on sexual violence in conflict last year described a disturbing trend of violence against very young boys and girls in multiple countries. It added that girls and boys are targeted in order to terrorize their communities because of perceived affiliations of their parents or their perceived utility or market value. Their perceived utility or market value. Nobel laureate Dr. Mukwege speaks of treating babies as young as 6 months old in his hospital for rape victims. We live in a world where child survivors of these crimes, of violence of all crimes, live with stigma and gaslighting and fear of retaliation at the hands of powerful perpetrators. Where in some countries, rape is not illegal and girls are forced to marry their rapists. And where survivors face an endless cycle of denial of their rights as well as stigma and ostracization, lasting decades after the conflict has ended, as in Bosnia or Uganda, and passed down across generations to innocent children. More often than not, in many settings, including Syria and Myanmar today, not a single perpetrator of alleged systematic conflict-related sexual violence has been held to account. Not a single one. These are all choices. The choices of the member states. Our choices. We have to be prepared to admit where we have failed and to do the hard work to support the survivors, change the laws and attitudes, and bring the perpetrators to account. Over many years, no matter the country or circumstances. And so far, we are not even coming close to this. Resolution 2467 also promised sanctions, justice, and reparations for victims and recognition for children born of rape. And these promises must be kept. So I urge you all to recommit to these promises today, to move beyond rhetoric and to implement your decisions. Please hold perpetrators account. Please address root structural causes of gender-based violence and discrimination in your countries. Please urgently increase funding for programs that address the needs of all of the survivors, especially the children. Thank you.